Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 21 of Dr. G at the Heart of Healthcare. Today, we have a special guest from Northern California, Craig Drasang of YoloCares, and he is the CEO. We're going to get into all those credentials in a minute, but I met him at the Hospice News ELEVATE conference last year, October, in Chicago, and I was just so struck by his presentation on the panel and his knowledge of the hospice industry and some of the things he shared about how we should unify between profit and nonprofit, and how we should have Medicare hospice benefit reform and the origins of hospice and the civil rights era. And we just kind of hit it off. And so welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dr. G. Happy to be here.
Thank you. So happy to have you. And I want to mention that, you're leading this nonprofit hospice agency, and that's what this is about, like the nonprofit world. So I want to learn about it. I want the listeners to be able to learn about it. So let's jump into this conversation. What's going on?
Okay, great. Well, nonprofit hospice is unique because we're really the founders that gave birth to the whole hospice movement in the country 40 to 50 years ago. We grew out of the civil rights movement, and in a time when there was no reimbursement, no pay structure for the kind of care we deliver. And people frequently say, out of the civil rights movement. And it was really a time when people were demanding that they have a voice and a say about a whole bunch of things about American life. And one of those issues that was important is for people to have a say about how and where they would die. Because before hospice, the physicians were viewed as God by their patients. So you just blindly followed whatever your physician told you without asking questions. And the hospital systems were the support for the physicians. And their approach for terminal illness at the time was to just cure, treat, and not really talk to the patient about where would you like to spend your final days? What's important to you? Here are the trade-offs to aggressive chemotherapy when you have stage 4 pancreatic cancer. What trade-offs are you willing to make? What are your values? What's going to be important to you? And so the hospice movement really was an offshoot of the civil rights movement that was all about giving Americans a say about how and where they were going to die or spend the final chapter of their life, and how to voice that with the care providers. So most nonprofits were founded by a mix of community members and physicians who were frustrated with the systems at the time. And they said, you know what, to hell with American healthcare. We're going to cobble together our own model of care, even though there's no reimbursement, because we're going to do better for our own family members, for our neighbors and members in our community. Mm-hmm. And that was really the birth of the modern hospice movement in this country. Over time, and in the 1980s, the Reagan administration facilitated a reimbursement mechanism, which we know is the hospice Medicare benefit, that allowed hospices who were certified by Medicare to get reimbursed for the care they provide. That ushered in for-profit companies into the mix, which competition can be good. But here in California, well, I'll give you an example and why this has become sort of an issue. We have more hospices in the city of Sacramento than there are in the entire state of Florida. What? Because we are not a certificate of need state that has sort of regulated who can hang up a hospice shingle. Because as you know, Dr. G, the quality can vary greatly. The kinds of support and programming you receive can vary greatly from one hospice to the next. And today we live in a world where the majority of hospice providers are funded through private equity or venture capitalists who, that's not to say you can't get good care at a for-profit or company, but the care will be different. And the unique piece that nonprofits bring to the table is their connectedness to the communities that gave them birth in the first place. We are the safety net for the communities we serve. Here in the Sacramento region, we're working with an organization that's not open yet. It's called Joshua's House. And it was started by the former director of the Cancer Center for UC Davis. Her grandson, she had a grandson named Joshua, and he died homeless on the streets. And she was very close to him, but he struggled with drug abuse over the years and, found himself in a situation where he became sick and was on the streets and died. And hence the name Joshua's House. And she said, that's not going to happen anymore in my community. So she started a movement to raise money and build a facility called Joshua's House that will be a home for terminally ill, unhoused individuals. It will be the first and only one on the West Coast right now. And so when the facility is finished, paid for, and when Marlene has some operating cash in the bank, we have an agreement that she will turn that program, the ownership and the operations, over to YoloCares. And we will be providing the safety net to our community because we have a high percentage of homeless folks up here, as I think most major cities do in California. So, that's just one of the many, many ways where we serve as a safety net for the communities we exist in.
Sounds so rewarding. I know you're the strong leader, but I know you must be proud deep in your heart.
I am proud, but from your work as a physician and medical director in end of life care, we are only as good as the teams we're surrounded by.
Yes.
And a lot of times, if I walk into the grocery store after work and I have my name badge or my lanyard from YoloCares still on me, people will say, "Oh, you work in hospice. You took care of my mother. God bless you. How do you do this work? We don't know how anybody could do this work." And the interesting thing is, when you talk to people whose profession is in hospice, you learn very quickly that this is really a calling. It is. It's not just a job. You're not clocking in and clocking out like a nurse would at maybe in the emergency department at a local hospital. This is really about a specific calling into this part of care. And so folks who are not cut out to do this or who don't have that calling, they don't last that long. But the ones who do, they can't imagine doing anything else.
Well, I mean, we're the heart of healthcare, right? That's what I think.
That's right.
Wow. Wow, that's really something. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I moved here almost 10 years ago from Chicago, and I thought we had a competitive healthcare and hospice landscape in Chicago. It has nothing on California. One of the reasons why Governor Newsom put a moratorium on the issuing of new hospice licenses last year is because if you think about this, we have more than a quarter of all the hospices in the country reside in the state of California. We have almost 1,300 hospices in California. The state of Florida, with a high number of elderly folks, only has 50 hospices in the entire state. So, it's made it challenging for for the legacy providers, the community grounded providers that started this industry to begin with, because we don't have just a small handful of competitors we're dealing with, because there are enough patients to support everybody in theory. But, you know, we had a gold rush in California back in the 1800s. Well, now we have an old rush, because we have more seniors living in the state of California than any other state in the country.
Mm-hmm.
We have 6 million seniors living here. And so folks who are behind private equity and wanting to generate a profit for their investors, they see this as prime country here in California to do that for a certain period of time and then probably sell and get out of the business or cash in. And while, you know, I'm all for capitalism, I really feel like what we do, Dr. G, is sacred ground.
Yes.
It has to be about more than that. It should be, but that's not the world we live in. So, you know, I would like to think that we'll be here in another 50 years. We're almost 50 years old. But I also tell my nonprofit colleagues all the time that we are an endangered species.
Mm.
You know, there was a time in the early 90s when nonprofit hospice represented 90% of all the hospices in the country. We now represent less than 20%. So, you know, and part of it possibly was due to institutional ego and arrogance, like, well, we've been here forever. Certainly the public knows about the quality of care and the value we bring to the community, but they don't. And, you know, one of the reasons why they don't is people just generally don't like to talk about end-of-life care or
Right.
the H word.
The H word.
Yes, yes. Yeah, you know, I'd be interested, your perspective. You know, over the years, I've sort of garnered a message for physicians when they feel like they have to tell their patients there's nothing more they can do. I always say, no, there is something more you can do, and it is hospice. You know, there's been so many studies done now that shows that people who access hospice care earlier in their diagnosis tend to live longer, they have a better quality of life, and their values are matched with the care they receive. And at the end of the day, that's what it's all about.
Do you guys see why I had lunch with this man in Chicago? Because you were just dropping knowledge on that stage and over lunch, and you're doing it here. I appreciate that. And I see the value. But for the average person, you know, who's reading these, you know, sensational articles that are pitting us against one another, the nonprofit world and the profit world, what's the difference is my number one question, besides, you know, the things you've highlighted clearly. But the person at the bedside is still that angel who has accepted the calling of the sacred work, that
Right.
that nurse, that social worker, that chaplain. They don't work for free. We still have to pay our bills. So how can we distinguish this? Like, how can we help people sift through all of this and get the care that these vulnerable people need at the end of life?
Yeah. Well, you know, one tool that the public has is to go to Medicare's website. Medicare, it's called hospicecompare.gov. And if you Google hospicecompare.gov, Gov, you will be directed to a page where you can type in the name of any hospice provider in your region and pull up their quality scores.
Yeah.
Now, there are a lot more quality scores than what appear on this very limited page, but it will give you an idea of how hospices compare in your region in terms of quality. You know, there are some quality metrics, though, that data doesn't capture. And I like to tell a story to describe sort of the nonprofit one of the nonprofit quality measures, and that is we had a nurse here. His name was Scott Goldsmith, and we are the only provider of care up in Yolo County. We're between San Francisco and Sacramento, and there's this region called the Cape Valley, and it's very rural. And none of the healthcare providers will go out there because they're paying clinicians, frankly, a lot of windshield time to drive out there and to provide care. It's expensive to do that. And we're the only provider of end-of-life care out in the Cape Valley. So Scott was seeing a patient who was well into his 90s. He lived alone. He had a caregiver occasionally who was there, and lived at the end of a gravel road in the middle of an almond orchard. And Scott went to see him one day, and he had a feeling that there was a chance that this patient was going to not make it through the night. And so when Scott got in the car to leave and started to drive back to the office, he suddenly got this notion, and he did a U-turn in the highway and headed back to this guy's house. He was a baseball fanatic, the patient was, and the World Series was playing that night. Scott pulled back up in his driveway, walked through his rickety screen door, and said, "Hey, do you mind if I watch the World Series with you tonight?" Mm-hmm. And the patient seemed relieved. And Scott, got his the guy's polyester couch in the living room all situated like a little nest for him to sort of lay down with his pillows and his blankets and watch the World Series. And towards the end of the game, Scott had his hand on his patient's arm, and he had gently and quietly slipped away. And when he got back to the office the next day, and we were talking to him about that experience, he said, "That's what I want. That's what I want in my final hours, in my final days, is to be somebody to be present and to care about me in that way." And it's interesting because Scott had a short stint where he was offered a lot more money to go work for a hospice company. And he didn't last 6 months, and he came back and he said, "You know what? They have time limits on how much time I can spend with my patients. This idea of turning my truck around and going to spend the rest of the evening with a patient, like I did with this guy in the Cape Valley, would have been frowned upon. I would have been disciplined for that." He said, "We have quotas we have to meet. I have 20 minutes to make a nursing visit. I have a certain number of visits I have to make every single day." And he said, every time we walk into a home, we're not sure what exactly we're walking into. Sometimes there's a family crisis. Sometimes there's a debate around what should be done with mom or dad, and the clinician has to be part of that conversation if they're there then. And you can't put a time limit on it. The care can be really different from one organization to another. And I would just say, it's important for people to become educated consumers, not just of healthcare, but of end-of-life care, because chances are we're all going to need it eventually. And it's better to bone up and know the questions you want to ask and what's going to be important to you now, rather than waiting for later.
Absolutely. And that's why I have this show, so that the resources there for the community. And I just appreciate you so much you're such a great storyteller, and I know you're a great writer from all the things on your website. I will have a link to that in the show notes. But I just appreciate all your sharing, just so rich. What I want to touch on is, I can't quote you from Elevate, but I remember you just kind of throwing up your hands on the stage, just saying, we need to just, I don't know if you used the word unify, or you talked about the California Hospice Network, and and the NHPCO and all these things you were dropping. I couldn't keep up, but it was about us just stop messing around and just get this thing together.
Right.
So you want to share a little bit of that if you remember what you were saying?
Yeah, well, it's actually about a subject that the greater public probably doesn't even know or care about, but for healthcare providers, it's a real issue. So because over the last few decades, there have been so many nefarious players that have entered the hospice industry just to turn a profit or make a buck. In fact, in California, it's common for people to flagrantly disregard the conditions of participation and the compliance issues around hospice, knowing that when they get caught, they just go out of business and they reopen in another county under another name with a different provider number, and they do it all over again. That is a very, very common thing. So the federal government has gotten, they're onto this. And so they have teams of auditors who they send out, and they're kind of hostile auditors. And there's a good aspect of that, because we want to weed out the nefarious players or the people who are purposely breaking the law. But the thing that Medicare is not doing is they're not making sure the audit teams they're sending out understand hospice, understand the conditions of participation. They're not credentialed. They're not really qualified to determine if the patient receiving care should or should not be on care. So you have these auditors who are leveraging huge penalties on not just for-profit nefarious players, but also on nonprofits who are well-intended and who actually raise philanthropic support to be able to provide a better, higher level of care. The best way I can describe this is early in my hospice career, 20 plus years ago, the organization I worked for in Chicago was under audit, and they're called ADRs, and they're like, we have to deal with this, and so I had to dive in and understand what really happened. Well, it was interesting. We had a chaplain who was doing his visit to an Alzheimer's patient who was on hospice care, and in the clinical note, the chaplain wrote, I had a good conversation with Mrs. Smith today. Well, according to the federal guidelines for being eligible or appropriate for hospice, if you have Alzheimer's, a patient who, one of the measures they use is that a patient who can string together, I think it's more than 6 words.
Yeah, the FAT score for everyone listening.
The FAT score.
7A.
Right. That could mean that they're not appropriate for hospice, and so that you have them on your service inappropriately. So the auditor picked up on that clinical note, and we all of a sudden received a stop payment for care on this patient's chart, and then they pull a whole bunch of other charts and look for similar discrepancies. Well, the problem with that is the patient, so they pulled, I think it was 13 charts, and said, we're denying payment because these people should not be on hospice. During the course of the audit, every single one of the patients died. So they were clearly eligible for hospice. But the auditors were trying to catch us on a technicality to keep from paying. And so, my rant at the conference in Chicago was really around all of the good hospice providers, for-profit and not-for-profit. We need to band together and insist on change from the federal government on who's doing the auditing, how we're audited, and what's really appropriate. Because catching a clinician who's in a hurry on how they're documenting maybe every T isn't crossed or I dotted, but at the end of the day, if the patient died 2 months later, they were eligible for hospice, but we were denied payment. It didn't matter because of how the clinician captured the visit in the medical record. And what the chaplain said, and he felt so bad about it. He said, "What I meant when I wrote in the clinical chart that I had a nice conversation with Mrs. Smith is that I had the conversation. She just laid there. She looked at me. She didn't really utter any words to me, but I had a nice conversation with her," is what he meant. But, those kind of nuances don't get considered when an auditor who's not trained in hospice and doesn't really care is reviewing the charts. The other problem I'll say is that Medicare can hire third-party vendors to do auditing for them. These third-party vendors frequently get paid based on what they find. So they're incentivized to find errors or to look for trouble, even if trouble isn't really there, because it's how they get paid. So we really need a complete revamp of this part of the hospice industry, and it's going to take all of us coming together and insisting on change, which is exactly how we were all birthed through the civil rights movement to begin with. So we need to get back to those roots, into that same spirit, and insist on change for the future.
I feel your call of action. My heart is racing over here, Craig. Oh my gosh. That's insane, by the way. And, I do have that little bit of fear of audit. I remember an old agency I was with, she mentioned, one of the folks mentioned that they are incentivized for finding errors and the length of stay and the cap and all that stuff that comes around. And I don't want to bore my lay listeners with that stuff, but those are some of the challenges, we face with things. And I'm glad you touched on that. And hopefully this can unify folks so we can make the industry better. Because that's why I'm here. Right. I want the industry to be better. For the people to be empowered to get the benefits that they desire and deserve, and for also clinicians and leaders like yourself to, share with us, because, we need good administrative leadership also to be able to do our clinical work. So I appreciate you so much. You're doing so many things up there. I saw an article about you and about the agency servicing, I guess, Native Americans up there, just in Hospice News last week. So any final things you want to share with folks before we let them go?
Just get educated about hospice before you need it. If you don't have an advanced care document filled out and signed about, simple things like, who do you want make the decisions for you around healthcare if you're unable to vocalize your own decisions? What will be important to you in your final chapter? Just take some time and fill out those documents now so that you don't create a crisis for you and your family later.
Oh, that's good. That's such good advice. And that reminds me, back on the last thing you were talking about, the Alzheimer's patient. I remember you had mentioned the length of stay being an issue. And,
Right.
As a patient declines in their trajectory, dementia, some of those things, they don't necessarily die in 6 months. Last a couple episodes ago, we talked to a gentleman who did have a wife who had a 6-month stint on hospice before
Right.
she died. I think probably because he watched her a lot of that time at home too, since he was a nurse. But nonetheless, that some folks are on there 2 years, 3 years. You can't send them back to their PCP when they're now 70 pounds. They're bed bound. We're just basically preventing infections in the sore. I remember you mentioned someone was called to testify in the state.
Oh yeah, Carrie
Remember
Cooley,
you said that?
Yeah, Carrie Cooley, who is a well-known hospice guru in the country, who helps
Oh yeah,
organizations.
Weatherby.
from Weatherby,
Weatherby.
right? Weatherby,
Yes.
who helps organizations when they get stuck in these audits. She had to testify before a judge about a patient who was denied payment. The organization was fined, and it was for a 93-year-old woman who weighed 70 pounds, and the hospice provider got dinged from the government because one of the criteria for determining continued eligibility for hospice care is weight loss. So the patient did not continue to lose weight after she hit 70 pounds. And Carrie said to the judge, she said, I don't know if you've ever weighed a bag of bones, but I have. And it doesn't weigh much less than 70 pounds. So I don't know how this poor woman at 93 years old would continue weight loss unless you severed a limb. At the end of the day, they won the case. But, her point is, we just went through a SMRC audit, and 4 of the charts that the auditor pulled were for patients between 96 and 103 years old. And I just wanted to say, really? Seriously, you're looking at patient charts for somebody who's 103, trying to figure out if they're eligible for hospice. Yeah, what I really want to say is, I think everybody should be eligible for hospice if they hit 90, no matter how healthy or sick they are. If you make it that far, because the reason why some people live longer when they're on hospice care is they're finally getting the kind of whole person attention and care that they should have been getting all along. And so people who are terminal can stabilize, can live longer, because they're finally getting the kind of care they should have been getting all along.
Woo, child. You just
I know.
drop the mic. Thank you so much for joining us. Woo. We could go on and on, but I think they need to digest this. I'm going to put a link to YoloCares in the show notes, that Hospice News article, and we'll throw Weatherby resources in there too. Carrie, I love her for saying that, because we have 206 bones and they must weigh about 70 pounds, right? So thank you so much for coming. It's such a joy to know you. Thank you for being a leader in the industry and sharing with us today.
Right back at you.
All right. Peace, everyone.
Thank you.